I use the concept of materialist context in the sense it is used in the historical bibliography. In his book, The Textual Condition, Jerome McGann differentiates between linguistic code and bibliographical code. The linguistic code is the set of words, punctuation marks, and grammatical structures that make up the text. It is where the making of meaning is first situated. McGann considers bibliographical code as the examination of the material levels of the text, the physical form of books and manuscripts, the paper, ink, typeface, page layout, price, illustration, etc. The concept of the bibliographical code not only offers a useful conceptual framework for the study of books, but can be taken further with periodical studies, which foregrounds the material aspects of periodicals. In the general introduction to the first volume of the Oxford Critical History of Modernist Magazines, Peter Brooker and Andrew Thacker recommend using the concept of bibliographical code as periodical code. And in his paper, Matthew Philpotts refines the periodical code concept and defines 5 additional codes: temporal codes, a journal's periodicity, regularity, and longevity, material codes, quality of paper, number of pages, binding, cover, etc., economic code, the financial backgrounds of publishing the periodical, its price and circulation, etc., social code. According to Philpotts, these codes, I quote him, cover the wide networks of actors involved in the creation, circulation, and reception of the journal, and include editorial personnel, contributor network, and readership. And finally, compositional codes, textual and visual design. With this theoretical background, I ask how the material context of the text determines the making meaning. In the following, I will focus on Mihály Babits' poem, Fortissimo, to present how the materialist context of different edition of a literary text can modify the potential meaning of a poem, while the text of the poem, or in other words, the linguistic code of the text, remains essentially unchanged. Mihály Babits was an important author of Hungarian literary modernity during the first part of the 20th century. The Fortissimo is one of the most anti-war poems by Babits. Also, unfortunately, there is no English language literary translation of it. Here you can see the Hungarian text of the poem and the rough translation by Miriam Grünwald. Fortissimo includes several biblical and literary allusions. It identifies God's inertia as the cause of the war, speaking like an angry orator who encourages his audience to call out for peace to a sleeping, deaf, or possibly dead God. The message of the poem not only went against the official wartime propaganda, it also offended contemporary religious feeling, which was the reason why prosecution was brought against the poet for blasphemy following the publication of the poem. In keeping with the theme of the conference, I would like to examine the opposition between the center and the periphery from 2 perspectives. The control of the political power over literary journal through the operation of censorship, and the role of the material medium in the construction of meaning, whereby the primary meaning of the text is enriched by new secondary meanings. If we examine the textualization of Fortissimo as a literary text, then its first stage is the authorial manuscript. This seems to be less relevant for periodical studies because its function to document how the linguistic code of the poem is developed and the text is created. The second stage of Fortissimo's textualization is the 1st of March 1917 issue of the periodical Nyugat. Nyugat was an influential journal in Hungarian literary modernity. It was founded in 1908 as a small circulation literary review that also signaled its cultural orientation through its name. It means West. It was published fortnightly until 1941, but when its financing became difficult, it was only published once a month. This is the temporal code. Babits was the last editor of the journal. The financial background of the Nyugat was provided by subscribers, advertisements in the paper, and the assimilated Jewish bourgeoisie, the industrial magnates. The circulation increased steadily, reaching 4,000 copies by 1918. This is the economical code. The program of Nyugat was theoretically indeed guided by purely aesthetic considerations, although its author, as intellectual, had different social and political point of views. Still, the editors and authors' network of relationship and the consistent rejection of the conservative literature assigned the paper to the political space of the liberal left. This is the social code. In addition, regarding the war, at least from the autumn of 1915, they increasingly represented a position that favored peace. This is also an important factor in the scandal of Fortissimo. The fact that Fortissimo was published in Nyugat seems to be self-evident, since by this time Babits was one of the most important poets of the Nyugat. However, his publication practice shows that during this year he published the same number of poems in Nyugat as in the political daily paper Pesti Napló. If Babits had wanted to emphasize the political aspect of the poem through the act of the publication, he would have published it in Pesti Napló. In contrast, in the essay he wrote during the administrative procedure, he defends himself by saying that the poem was published in a periodical, the audience of which is only looking for a literary point of view. After its publication, Nyugat was likely reported to the authorities. The denunciation might have been due to a previous political conflict. In October 1915, Jenő Rákosi, the editor-in-chief of the pro-government Budapesti Hírlap, launched a media campaign against Endre Ady and Babits, which even caused Babits to lose his job as a secondary school teacher. Therefore, Babits suspected Rákosi behind the prosecution launched because of Fortissimo. However, this may not have been the case, since according to the legislation in force at the time, paper was obliged to submit copies for the state scrutiny exercised by censorship offices. Censor issued confidential or strictly confidential bans precepts to editorial offices. In more radical cases, all copies of given issue might be confiscated. It is a fact, however, that based on the decision of the court, the incriminated issue of Nyugat was confiscated the day after its publication. A few days later, the court lifted the ban and Nyugat could be circulated again, also without Fortissimo. The censors thus deleted the literary text from the issue and left the place of the missing text blank. This is the compositional code of the first edition of Fortissimo. Thus, even though the text itself was not made visible to the readers of the paper, but the trace of the censorship was displayed as a warning sign. Also, the process had been launched against the poet for a religious infraction. Because of the anti-war content of the poem, this form of censorship was also part of the wartime propaganda. On the day after Nyugat was confiscated, the daily papers reported about the event, and from the reports of the left-wing media, it is clearly they knew the poem as they published excerpts from it. For example, Lajos Hatvani, author and Mäcenas of the Nyugat, as well as owner of the Pesti Napló, defends Babits twice in his own newspaper. He refuted the accusation of blasphemy with the way the poem was embodied in the religious tradition, and he spoke out for the freedom of thought and art. Thus, contemporary newspaper readers not only learned that Nyugat had been seized due to the Babits poem, but even if they could not read the entire work, they had some idea of the topic and the tone of Fortissimo. Having been banned by wartime censorship, disseminating the poem continued through other channels in manuscript and typewritten formats. Despite the seizure, the poem was circulated widely, and the Babits legacy holds several letters in which the poet is asked to send a copy of his banned poem. Paradoxically, the news that the poem had been deleted by the censors was a good publicity for Fortissimo. Fortissimo was not only disseminated in Hungarian, not long after its ban, it was also published in other languages. Thus, in this sense, it changed language and medium at the same time. In June 1917, the poem was published in French in the Swiss periodical Le Plus Grand Monde, a short-lived progressive journal translated by Adam Lovan. During the war, the German translation of the poem received more attention. Following the ban, Fortissimo was published in German in 2 different anthologies, translated by Henrik Horváth, a friend of Babits. The Action, the Journal of German Expressionism, published the international anthology Das Aktionbuch in 1917. The anti-war nature of the selection is demonstrated by the fact that works by French, English, and Russian authors are also presented beside German writers and authors from nationalities belonging to the Central Powers, and not only contemporary authors, but also some from the 19th century, for instance, Balzac, Baudelaire, or Tolstoy. The translation of Fortissimo, representing the contemporary Hungarian lyric poetry in this international compilation, and this new context foregrounds the poem expressionistic poetic characteristics. Also, all this is also interesting because Babits can be considered as an avant-garde author, like Balzac, Baudelaire, or Tolstoy, of course. The other anthology is Neue Ungarische Lyrik, which contains Horváth's translation of Hungarian poems. The collection aims to introduce German readers to the Hungarian poetry of the previous few decades. It wants to showcase the revival that had been taken place in Hungarian literature around the turn of the century. Most poems in the anthology were written by the poets of Nyugat and those who had paved the way for the literary modernity they represented, publishing the largest number of the poems by Babits. This anthology thus presented Babits as the most important contemporary Hungarian poet, and Fortissimo is the piece that represented Babits' latest poetry. Not long after the end of the war and the revolution, Fortissimo was published twice again within a short period of time. First, in a diadalmas forradalom könyve, the Book of the Triumphant Revolution, edited by Oskar Gellért, also a contributor of Nyugat. The book contains the confessions of members of the people's government, people who had participated in the revolution, and 75 Hungarian writers. The publication lists Babits among the writers who had participated in paving the way for the revolution. Although Babits was attacked for his pacifism on several occasions during the war, it is no coincidence that this book included the poem that the censors had banned earlier. The materialist context of this publication of Fortissimo emphasizes the political role played by the poem. The revolutionary transformation of the social political setup can be understood as a precondition of the publication of the poem. The political meaning linked to the Fortissimo in this medial context still define the publication and reception of the poem and the making of meaning. The Nyugat was republished the poem a few days later. Beside a tithe of the poem, a note drew attention to the unique publication history of Fortissimo. I quote it. From an old issue of Nyugat, which was confiscated because of this poem. Thus, this is not the first time Fortissimo was reprinted in Hungarian, but the repeated publication of the poem in Nyugat is not only a symbolic gesture, but a different kind of performative act in contrast to an anthology that foregrounds solely the political context. The fact that it was published again signaled that the war is over, political power no longer limits the freedom of artistic expression, and the new political system does not incriminate the Babits poem based on religious or other grounds anymore. From the point of view of Nyugat, all this also means the gap indicated by the blank pages of the earlier issue is filled with content again. And so the original intact state returns, which also shows that the possibility for the autonomous functioning of literature has been created. Further reprints of Fortissimo took place during the editing of different volumes. It was first included in the collection of Babits poems in the 1920 edition of Nyugtalanság völgye, The Valley of Unrest, followed by Babits selected poems in 1928 and his completed works in 1937. These stages in the publication history of Fortissimo do not reference transparently the abuse of the wartime censorship anymore. The poem being placed in the center of the volume and in this new context amplifying the religious aspect of the poetic processing of the historical events keeps distance from the works that reflect on the current event which have strong political references. Therefore, the composition of the volume also implies that by this time Babits might have wanted to blend the earlier clear-cut political meaning of the poem. Okay, finally. I hope that this brief overview has shown how during the various publication of Fortissimo, a work of art with a unique publication history, the original anti-war purpose of the poem gain new aspects of meaning depending on what new materialist context the poem was published in. All this, of course, can also be explored and described with the help of traditional philological methodology, but the historical bibliography and periodical studies offer an approach that puts the different textual histories in new context, from the genesis of the works to the reception.